The reading is John chapter 10, verses 11 to 18. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheepfold. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father.
The image of a shepherd and their flock is one that we encounter throughout our scriptures. Probably the most well-known example of that is the 23rd Psalm, which is another of our lectionary readings for today, and of course echoes through a lot of the music that we've used in this service. And we chose to begin this time together with another of the Psalms that conveys a very similar theme, including those words, "We are his people, the sheep of his pasture." Like I said, it is a very common theme. And those words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," have brought hope and comfort to countless people over the centuries. So we might not be surprised that in describing himself and his identity and his ministry, Jesus uses this imagery of a good shepherd. And if we might allow ourselves a little bit of technical theology this morning, before we think about the richness of the narrative that surrounds it, we might notice that Jesus is pressing home his credentials here. While there is a whole lot more to them than that, the key message of the Gospels is about the identity of Jesus, about declaring to us who Jesus is. Now today we're looking at John's Gospel, who begins with a profound assertion that Jesus is the Word made flesh, God become human. And that isn't a statement that he just pulls out of the air. It's a truth that is embedded in the life and ministry of Jesus. And it's there to be seen and to be recognised by those with eyes to see. And so, as John recalls Jesus declaring himself to be the Good Shepherd, he invites us to make those connections with the Old Testament and statements like, "The Lord is my shepherd and we are his people, the sheep of his pasture." Because we're invited to embrace this Jesus, this figure that few would have disputed at the time had lived and died. But we're invited to embrace him as more than just someone who lived and died, but as none other than God himself, the Lord, who an Old Testament king declared to be his shepherd, now come as the Good Shepherd. And so here's one of those places in the biblical narratives where our understanding of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit is founded, because Jesus is equating himself with the Father, the God of the Old Testament. And as we shall go on to recognise, it was this assertion that so often brought Jesus into conflict with the religious authorities of his day. But Christian discipleship is about more than proving a point or signing up to a set of beliefs. It's about a real and living relationship with that Good Shepherd. And that's very much the point that Jesus is making here. Jesus may have said what he did in response to a religious debate, but contained within those words is something far more significant and tangible. The possibility of a real and living relationship with this God for ourselves. A relationship that might have been defined in the midst of a religious conversation in first century Palestine, but a relationship that is no less real and no less relevant to those of us who live in this 21st century world of ours. Because this is a discussion, this whole narrative is largely all about relationships. And as you look at those words which Stephen read for us, just look at how many times various relationships are mentioned here. In verse 14, Jesus speaks of his relationship with the sheep. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And as is often the case in conversations with Jesus that John records, he then compares this with his own relationship with the Father. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, it continues into verse 15. And if you joined our service last week, you may remember that this self-same dynamic was present in the commission that Jesus gives to his followers after his resurrection. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And then Jesus goes on to speak about relationship in other ways too. They listen to my voice. I lay down my life for them. As I said, Jesus is describing a living and dynamic relationship. And we recognize the power of what he's saying when we focus particularly on the statement that he makes in verse 16. I have sheep that are not of this fold, and I must bring them also. And they too will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. And we begin to recognize the power, and dare I say the controversy of that statement, when we draw the lens back a little bit and recognize the context into which Jesus is speaking. Because if we go back to the beginning of John chapter 10, we notice that Jesus is specifically speaking to the Pharisees, the religious leaders and law teachers of his day. And then if we go back into chapter 9, we discover something of why Jesus is specifically speaking to the Pharisees. Because there's just been, frankly, one almighty row with them and their cronies, because they're outraged at what Jesus has just done. And what has Jesus done? He's healed a man who had been born blind. He had restored a broken, outcast, forgotten individual that even his disciples saw as more of a problem to debate than a person to be included. And when confronted with what Jesus had done, the teachers of the law wanted to explain it away, because they couldn't bear the idea that someone like Jesus, that they were so opposed to, could have such obvious power and anointing. Because it was only if Jesus really was who he claimed he was, God in human form, that good shepherd of Psalm 23, calling in on his people, so to speak, that Jesus would be able to do those kind of things. And they couldn't deal with that. They couldn't deal with it to the point that they actually threw the guy who Jesus had cured out of their synagogue. Can you see the tragedy and yet the irony of that? Here is a man who had encountered Jesus, whose life Jesus had transformed, whose brokenness Jesus had healed, thrown out of their religious institution for having the audacity to be healed and restored and made whole by Jesus. And Jesus goes so far as to turn on those Pharisees and say, you're the ones who are blind because you just cannot see the presence of God when it's staring you in the face, or words to that effect. So this is the context into which Jesus declares that he is the good shepherd. This is the context into which Jesus begins to redefine what it means to be God's people. And it isn't a matter of which sheepfold you're in or which flock you think you belong to, but whether or not you have a relationship with the right shepherd who is drawing all kinds of people into this new flock that Jesus speaks of. And that, I think, is where this reference to the hired hand comes in. I don't think for a minute Jesus is condemning here anyone who receives any kind of stipend or salary for their Christian ministry. But I appreciate that some of you might argue, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But I think Jesus is actually saying something far more profound. We're told that shepherds of that day did have a very strong bond with their flock, and often as they travelled around, the various flocks would begin to mingle and merge, and there would be key times when they needed to be sorted out. And they'd be sorted out by listening to the voice of the shepherd. And that's perhaps where things are different to how we experience sheep farming today. Now, it does seem to me at the moment that with so much else still so restricted, that there seems to be a programme on broadcast television about farming just about every day at the moment. And of course, at this time of year, the sheep and their lambs do seem to be somewhat taking centre stage. But our contemporary experience of sheep farming, particularly here in the UK, is very much organised around the land. This is my field, and you can pretty much assume that the sheep that are in it are my sheep. And we put nice dry stone walls around those fields to mark them out. And we put a gate on them so that we can control which of the sheep go in and which go out, and when they go in and when they go out. And that's kind of how the system works in our own context. And that's very much how the Pharisees saw the world too. The nation was their field. Their nation, of course, was God's field. That was the only field that God was interested in their eyes. And their interpretation of the law, in their eyes, was the equivalent to the walls that were around that field. And they were the people who managed the gate. They were the ones who felt that they had the right to declare who was in and who was out. And a hired hand is someone who has the technical skills to manage that kind of a setup. Someone who bases their oversight of the sheep on knowing how to manage and to control the necessary procedures. Someone whose engagement with the sheep is based on their technical know-how. And of course, for the scribes and the Pharisees, their technical know-how was their endless interpretations and prescriptions of God's law. They didn't see people as people, they saw them as objects to control and to debate and to discuss. And on that basis, they felt that they had the right to declare who was in and who was out in terms of God's flock. And in their eyes, Jesus was very much out. But Jesus speaks of an entirely different setup, one that was based on the way that migrant shepherds tended to operate in his day, where there was far more open countryside, far more common land, and it wasn't all neatly divided into fields. And so you wouldn't look at a mass of sheep grazing on a hillside and assume that they all belonged to the same person. But the shepherds managed those flocks through their relationship with the sheep. Each would have their own call, a voice that the sheep recognised. And when the time came for those flocks to be sorted, the shepherd would call the sheep and the sheep would gather around the shepherd. They just instinctively knew who they belonged to. And Jesus says, that's what my kingdom is all about. It's not about being able to manage and manipulate the sheep like a hired hand. It's not about prescribing rules. It's about relationships. It's about a relationship with the sheep, a relationship in which each knows the other, and the sheep recognize the voice of the one to whom they belong. And I think that has some important things to say to us as those who might be described as God's people, the sheep of his pasture today. And I guess that with everything that's happened in recent months, we may well feel like that's those sheep who were scattered all over the hillside. All the familiar landmarks of our church buildings and routines have been somewhat stripped away. And there are some real words of encouragement and hope for us in what Jesus has to say here. Because no matter how confused and scattered those sheep might have been, they still belonged to the shepherd. And so long as they knew how to recognise and how to respond to the shepherd's voice, they would find their way to where they belonged. The shepherd knew where the places of safety were. The shepherd knew how to navigate the terrain. And by listening to his voice, they could be assured of finding their way there too. And so this might be a moment to be reminded of what defines our identity. We are called to be those who know the voice of the shepherd. You see, that's what happened in the case of the man that Jesus cured from blindness in the previous chapter. He may not have fitted the religious expectations of the hired hand Pharisees, but he recognized in Jesus someone he could trust and follow, someone that he could believe in. And that's the kind of people that we're called to be. A people who are so invested in our relationship with Jesus that we see this as what defines everything else. This is the voice that we seek. This is the voice that we recognize. This is the voice that we follow. And the point that Jesus particularly makes to his critics, the Pharisees, is that this relationship brings us into contact with those and a sense of belonging with those who might not have otherwise expected to find ourselves with. I have sheep that are not of this fold, says Jesus. And so he doesn't condemn outright the legalism of the Pharisees, but he does challenge their exclusivity, their assumption that only they were right and wrong, and only they could declare who belonged and who didn't belong to God's people. Our God is not a God who simply conforms to our expectations. So as well as being called to be a people who live in clear and living relationship with the Good Shepherd, we're also called into relationship with those who are similarly committed to being faithful followers of Jesus. And they may come from different backgrounds or folds, to use the metaphor that Jesus employs here. They may express their relationship with Jesus in very different ways to how we do. But we belong together through our common relationship with Jesus. Jesus is not in the business of building containers and folds. He's in the business of building a community, of building a flock. And that invitation to break the mould in our thinking, I sense, can again serve as an encouragement to us at the moment, because we are having to navigate very unfamiliar and challenging territories. You know, I've lost count of how many times I've heard the word unprecedented in the last 12 months or so. And if our faith and our understanding of God was entirely founded on everything being fixed and familiar and everything being defined and explained in the way that those Pharisees assumed, then yeah, we'd be in big trouble right now. Because our nice, neat, tidy world has been utterly disrupted and turned on its head. And if we're honest, we've actually discovered that the world was not half as neat and tidy as we thought it was. But God does not come to us as a hired hand with techniques and clearly mapped out plans, but as a shepherd, someone who offers us a relationship, someone who assures us that he is with us in the midst of the unknown and the unexpected. A God who himself might be working amidst all of that unexpectedness. And if we look back again at that classic description of the Good Shepherd that we find in Psalm 23, we can remember that yes, there are times when we will walk through green pastures and still waters. But God is no less present when our journey takes us through the valley of shadows, when we're surrounded by uncertainty and fear, because the Lord is our shepherd. I know my sheep, says Jesus. And just let that sink in for a moment too. Whatever you're facing right now, whatever life might be throwing you away, however uneasy and uncertain you may feel, whatever doubts or struggles you may be harbouring, Jesus knows. Jesus knows us as intimately as Jesus and the Father knew one another. And if you're wondering just how strong that bond and that commitment is, look at what Jesus says here again and again. I lay down my life for the sheep. That's how committed I am to you, says Jesus. That is how far I am prepared to go to secure your salvation. And it's not a matter of which club you think you belong to or which religious group chooses to exclude or affirm you, but whether or not you are willing to recognize and respond to my voice. And Jesus emphasizes here too that his death was not some uncontrollable accident, some unfortunate mistake. No one takes it from me, says Jesus. I lay it down of my own accord. The death of Jesus was an act of will on his part, an act of will that emerges from his love for us and his commitment to us as the sheep of his pasture. So yeah, we are navigating some difficult territory at the moment, but we have a shepherd who knows us and invites us to follow him. And that territory might be quite unknown to us, but it is not unknown to the shepherd. And our shepherd is utterly committed to his sheep. So listen out for the shepherd's voice. That is all that those sheep were being invited to do. That's all they needed to do if they were to know the safety and the security that the shepherd offered. Get to know the shepherd's voice and have the courage to respond to the shepherd's voice. That's the only instruction manual that we really need if we're going to find our way through these difficult times. So, as we continue this challenging and unexpected journey, let us draw strength from that timeless but profound statement. The Lord is my shepherd.